In this video, we're going to cover SignalR Authentication and Authorization. Because the programming model is so similar to how you do it for the controllers, where you just decorate your classes or methods with the authorize attribute, we're going to take a look at how you'd expect to use those attributes and how you'd expect authentication and authorization to happen with the controllers, and how it's different for your SignalR hubs and what you need to watch out for. One of the prerequisites for this video is I'm not going to be teaching too much about the actual authentication and authorization mechanisms of ASP.NET Core. I have a playlist for that, so if you don't know anything about that, go ahead and watch it. In addition, in the description you will find links to the source code and the playlist. There will be a follow-up video on how to handle expired authentication sessions based on what you're going to learn in this video. We have a lot to cover, so let's dive in. As always, we'll start with inspecting the project starting at the startup. We have two authentication schemas, cookie one and the token one. I am expecting you to have your own authentication mechanism, either regular identity, identity server, whatever it is. I don't have that kind of implementation. I am mocking my authentication. Two schemas, my custom cookie schema and the JWT bearer schema. For this, I am using a package. However, I am just overriding a bunch of things. So it's not real JWT bearer authentication where it's checking against an authentication server to validate things, etc. Starting with a custom cookie authentication schema, we will go here and it's just an authentication handler implementation. Again, if you're already confused here, go watch the authentication series. I'm not going to be teaching these specific things. But what I'm doing is I'm checking, is SignalR auth cookie present? If it is, construct my claims principal and use that as the user for the current request context. Otherwise, we fail authentication. So all I'm doing is I'm requiring to have the presence of a cookie. I'm not doing any encryption on the payload of the cookie or anything like that. The value that comes out, I'm not putting it for data protection. That's just going to be the user ID, and I'm assigning here. The way that I'm going to obtain a cookie is I have the get cookie endpoint, where I'm just generating a new GUID. I am saying append this SignalR cookie, and that's what's going to get stored in the browser. Coming back to the top, we'll now take a look at the JWT bearer authentication configuration here. You can find similar code in their documentation, so I'm just going to take a little bit more of a deeper dive and what we're going to be using things for what. What I'm doing here is if I have an access token in the query string of the request, I'm just doing the same thing I'm doing for my cookie authentication. I'm just constructing a claims principal and I'm authenticating right here. You wouldn't do this. What you would do is you would extract the token and you would assign it to the token field unless you know what you're doing. And if you don't know, I'll explain in just a second how you can choose what to do and how this token will get used. But this is what you would generally want to do, and you can find this code again in the documentation. But I'm constructing my own claims principal. Again, the user ID is just the value of the access token, and then I'm putting a token specific claim here. And I'm enabling this kind of authentication only for the protected endpoint and the token endpoint. The protected endpoint is where the hub lives, right here. The token endpoint is where I'm going to be testing controller-like authorization. We also have an endpoint for testing controller-like cookie authentication. These are just for the cookie and token authorization schemas, or rather policies, which I have defined here, and they're super simple. Cookie policy is a policy that requires you to have a custom cookie schema, authenticated user. Same thing for the token, just a authenticated user from the custom token authentication schema, which is when we're constructing these relevant claims identities, we're passing the schema under which they're authenticated into the identity. And that's how the mechanism is going to figure it out. If you're confused about why this works, we're going to look at JWT bearer internals. We'll come to this method here. We'll come here, and again, we'll see JWT bearer handler. It's an implementation of the authentication handler. And if we come down here, custom cookie implements authentication handler. It forces us to implement handle authenticate async. We'll take a look at the JWT bearer handler. Again, same interface. Come down to the same function that does the implementation. And let's step through it one by one. The message receive event happens early in the process. So what we're doing here is we're creating a new event object with a new function that essentially handles this event. First, we have a null token. It doesn't really matter, but some kind of context gets created here, and then this context gets passed into this message received function. This is what we're hooking into here, and this is the message received context that we have here, right? So same type that gets generated here. All it has is just has the context, the schema, the options, and some additional properties on it that we're going to set. We pass the message received context into the message received function, and then we're checking. Is result doesn't equal null? If it doesn't, just return. So if whatever result we have here, we override all the other functionality that this handler has, which is cool, which is what we're doing with the success here. If we take a look at what the success function does, it sets the result to success with the following principles, properties, and schemas with which we're setting here. So on this context, we set the principle, and then on this success, this function will utilize the principle that we've set and assign it to the result. So coming back to the JWT handler, we essentially have the result and we exit here. Now, this is because I'm mocking my authentication and I'm choosing to put this result here. Otherwise, you wouldn't have this part specifically unless you know what you're doing and you want to have your custom way of constructing a claims principle based on the information of the access token rather than using the JWT bearer handler. Otherwise, we're going to look for the token, and this is what you would usually do. Do you have an access token in the query? Set it on the token property, and then this way in the JWT bearer handler, you're going to override the default behavior of looking for the token in the authorization bearer header. And that's all that happens under the hood. If you don't want to look in the authorization bearer header, you just have to do this mechanism of extract the access token from a place that you want, assign it to the context.token, and then you've overridden the way that we extract the token, and then it goes ahead and works with it. So that's that bit. Again, authorization policies, we've went over that. SignalR hub, user ID provider. I mean, this is in the documentation and should be quite straightforward. If we want to have a correct user identifier set on the context of the request, we have to tell SignalR how to extract that user identifier, and this is what this interface does. What is the current user ID? This is how you find out. Whatever value is going to be returned here. In the hub, you're going to have context.userIdentifier. This is the value that is going to be populated. Otherwise, you don't really need to do it. You can always extract all the claims that you have on the user here. And this user is going to be whatever claims principle I construct either here or here, and not the identity, rather this thing here. Since we're looking at the hub, last couple of things, let's just take a look at where it's being registered. On the /protected endpoint, which we're monitoring for the access token, here is where the hub is registered, so protected hub. We have the get cookie endpoint where we get the cookie, so we just assign the SignalR cookie and that's going to be saved in the browser. We have two endpoints /token/cookie where I'm just going to check controller-like authorization, and then the rest of this is just user ID provider and authentication handler, which we already went over. In the protected hub, we just have the authorized cookie and authorized token endpoints. Where I compile a result, this is just going to serialize to JSON. We just want to take a look at what the identity looks like. So this is just for debugging purposes, really, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be tinkering with the behavior of authorization and authentication in SignalR. Let's close this. Shouldn't have closed the protected hub as I'm going to be flicking stuff over. Taking a look at index.html, we create a connection. We have a connect method where we basically have a little notification if 30 seconds passed. Tell me, you will see why this is relevant a little bit later. We have a couple of methods for getting the cookie, hitting the cookie protected and token protected endpoints on the protected hub. These two right here. So the get cookie, again, you kind of know where that is. And then there are these two methods, test cookie, where we hit the cookie endpoint and the startup here. So we're going to test authorization here. And then we're going to have a test token function as well, which is going to hit the token endpoint. And we're either going to append the token or not append the token. And this is just to understand, just this behavior. So quick overview of the code. Again, you will understand a little bit more as we go through it. Feel free to pause here, familiarize with it, play with it, but let's go ahead and actually start testing things. Here I have a browser session on the index.html page, so we will have access to all the functions that I've defined here. First thing that I'm going to make sure is I'm going to go to the application. I already have a SignalR auth cookie here from previous testing, so I'm going to delete that so you know I don't have any cookies here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the test cookie function. This is where we just call the cookie endpoint. I'm going to call it and I'm going to get a 401. And I mean, that's fine. We're also going to test the token endpoint and we're going to get a 401 because we're hitting /token and we don't have an access token. So first, let's go ahead and get a cookie. We hit the /get cookie endpoint, and this is going to put a SignalR auth cookie into our browser. Now that we're here, we can go ahead and call the test cookie endpoint. We'll get a result with the ID of the user. So if we take a look at the application, you'll see the cookie value that is being stored here. It is not data protected or anything, so don't come at me with how production ready this solution is. It's not. Here's the value. So we're basically allowed to hit this endpoint. Again, if we test the token endpoint, just because we have a cookie, it doesn't mean that we can access this token endpoint. And we're using the fetch API here, and the SignalR is similar to fetch API, where you don't really need to do anything extra to pass the cookie in the requests. Okay, so in the network tab, the requests that we're making, right, the cookie will just get appended here in the request header automatically for SignalR and for the fetch API. So for test token, we can't access it because if you remember in the code, what we're doing is we are trying to extract the access token from the header for /protected and /token, right? If you take a look at the implementation of test token, I'm allowed to pass a string here, and that will just append it to the access token query string of the request. And this way we get a response with the ID provided. Now, why did we do this? For this, I wanted to build a base layer of your understanding that if something is protected by the cookie policy, you can only access it if you're authenticated with a custom cookie schema. If you have the token policy, you can only access it by being authenticated with a custom token schema. Simple, right? And that is what we're doing here. Moving towards SignalR, here we have the protected hub. We're doing the same thing. We have a cookie protected endpoint and a token protected endpoint. We set the token policy here and the cookie policy here. Let's see what happens. Coming back, I'm going to clear this, and just to refresh your mind, with the index.html, I'm going to first initiate a connection. We already have a cookie, and the token will be assigned automatically as well through this access token factory. If you don't specify this option, no token will be appended to the access token query string. If you want to supply your own query string, like that dash is not very good, but something like this, and you want to access that AQ in your hub, that was actually a question. You can basically do that. You will need to get the HTTP context and then the request, and then you can access the query string, right? So if you want to pass it in a custom query string, you can. I'm not sure why you would do that, but you can if you want to. So this is just SignalR code, and I mean, you can find that in the documentation. They don't really explain what I'm going to explain now. We're going to call connect. We're connected, and we're going to call cookie and token. Let's start with cookie. We're going to be unauthorized, okay? And we're gonna call token, and we're unauthorized as well. What is going on? Clearly, we've said authorize us with a cookie and authorize us with a token, and it doesn't allow us to do neither. So let's start with an authorize attribute on the protected hub. So we'll start that. You'll see this little icon here. It's refreshing. Once that's finished, again, we're going to connect, and this time we're just gonna get a full-blown error. So 500, let's take a look at what it is. And the first thing is that no authentication schema was specified, and that is specifically on the protected hub that we have here. So again, let me pull this down. I've specified that this is an authorized protected hub. However, I didn't specify an authentication schema. And in the startup, if I go all the way up here, add authentication, there is no default authentication schema. So if I would have put this to be something like this, we would have been all right. So let me save that. Again, I'm gonna remove that in just a second. So we'll come back here. Gonna say connect, and now we can connect. For the cookie endpoint, we can hit the cookie, and for the token endpoint, we can hit the token. Why can we hit the token? Well, you'll just see this in a second. But anyway, I'm just gonna remove this because we're gonna be overriding the schema on the hub. So this is only like kind of like the beginning of how messed up it is, but we'll set the authorize attribute here, and we will specify the schema with which we want to authorize on the hub rather than specifying a default authentication schema across our whole service. We'll just say, all right, for this hub, use this authentication schema. Let me drop down the terminal. We're going to come back to the browser. We're going to connect. Again, we're going to say connect with cookie. And this is the identity that we're getting back here. So again, if you didn't stop and take a look at the compile result that we're returning here, we're just returning the identifier and then all the claims. So these claims, this is why I'm kind of putting them here. We can then see what kind of identity we're using to access the endpoints. But anyway, let's go to the token and we can access it, even though we can see we only have the cookie authentication schema here. And I can prove this by, again, going back here. Let's say we're not going to be passing any token stuff here. This is going to refresh. Again, we'll connect, cookie, token. So no token authentication is happening. We're still able to access the token decorated protected endpoint, whereas if we would have a regular endpoint authorized with a token policy, if we don't have a token, we can't access it, essentially. This is the first really bad behavior of SignalR. Let's bring this back here. And we're just gonna keep going, and by the end of it, we'll come up with a couple of definitions, rules for us, which we can remember. Coming back to the protected hub, I'm going to comment this out. I'm gonna bring in this comment where we're basically saying for this protected hub, use the custom cookie schema and use the custom token schema. This will change a little bit of behavior. However, it won't change the fact that this token policy schema doesn't have any effect. Come back here, we'll say connect. We'll go to the cookie endpoint, and here we'll see more claims being added. User ID in the token with index 1 is what I'm setting here. This user ID is the first one that's being resolved here. Otherwise, if we go to the token endpoint, same thing gets returned. So let's take a look at the claims. We have 2 user IDs. The first one is being selected here, and the same thing happens there. So the lesson that we're going to take away here is if you want multiple schema identities being loaded, let's say you have a cookie and you have a token, if you want both of them loaded, you need to specify the schemas on the top here. Adding the schemas to these authorized attributes doesn't make any difference. If you want to do authorization based on a specific schema, what you want to do then is you want to do it based on the claim. So here I would have a token specific claim. I'm going to re-enable here. So yeah, the lesson here, and I will add a comment, schema gets ignored in SignalR. And we would rather want to depend on a specific claim from that identity schema. So let's try this. Coming back here, refreshed, let's connect, let's access cookie. There we go. Let's access token, and we can still access it because we have the token claim. Let's come back to index.html. We're going to disable token authentication. We're going to connect cookie and then token. We're able to access cookie. We're unable to access token. Again, to reiterate, on the authorized attribute, we're specifying what identity schemas should be loaded. On the policies, it doesn't really matter what schemas you specify. They get ignored anyway, and you should depend on the claims rather than authentication schemas. If you ask me why this is happening, I don't exactly know. I did not dig through their code and try to find the bug and fix it. So if you want to know a little bit more, go pick it up with them, go report this issue to them, but I kind of know how to work around it. Now, for the last bit of functionality to understand is we're going to come to this map hub and this get cookie here, and we will try to understand the point of expiring authentication sessions. Because what I have right now is a session cookie. As soon as I close the browser, the cookie is going to disappear. But I'm going to set an expiry. So this cookie is going to expire 30 seconds, and I'm going to bring ourselves back into the world of HTTP, and I'm going to only enable long polling. So the way that you do this is you can say transports, long polling, that's it. With just long polling enabled, let's go ahead and see what happens. Get cookie. We're going to connect, and here we can call cookie. Everything will be fine. This call goes through the network here, so we'll call cookie, right? All is good. For the application cookie that I actually have here, it actually, well, has an expiry date. So after some time, it will actually disappear. And to be specific, it will be 30 seconds. So this is why I have this finito flag here. Kind of tells me 30 seconds have passed. If I flick over the tabs, browser automatically removes the cookies. So then when we try to make the call again, because with long polling, we're making each individual HTTP request, it's going to find out that the session has expired. This is only true for long polling. If we're in the WebSocket or server sent event world, what is going to happen, and I'm just going to comment this out so you're aware of this when you're pulling down the code. Again, I'm going to come back here. I'm going to keep this network tab open. Let's go ahead, try to connect because we're not going to have the cookie. It's going to explode. We're going to get the cookie. I apologize if the screen is too small for some of you to see, but let's connect. And we're going to hit the cookie endpoint so we know we're able to access data. The connection is over this socket here, so you will see in the headers, in the initial request headers, we're passing the cookie. If you remember from the first couple of videos, what we know about WebSocket connection, it is the initial request is set at the beginning, and it just stays there. How is the backend meant to know about the cookie expiring on the browser if no new requests are being sent, right? So application cookie has expired. Can we still access the backend? Yes, we can, because the identity is created at the first call as well, okay? So let's take a look at this real quick. So in the startup, the first time that we connect to the hub, this is the one time that this runs. It doesn't run every time we send a message. It runs only when we establish the connection. So this identity gets created and is persistent while the connection is there. This raises a whole other concern of how do I find out when my session has expired? How do I handle errors and all that stuff? This is what the next video is going to be about, and hopefully you've enjoyed this one. As always, if you have any questions, ask them in the comments section or on the Discord server. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.